Hello there and welcome back. I'm Martin, and today on Daddy Roll the One, I'm going to be doing another installment in my series on the history of early tabletop role playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. And specifically, I'm going to be doing sort of a class overview on some of the classes that were introduced in Dragon Magazine in the early days of the hobby. So if you're not aware, this is going back into the mid 70s up through about 1980, I think was the cutoff. And back then, we didn't have the internet to share things. So nowadays, we kind of take it for granted. Like people can create a new class or a new background or whatever, a new species, and they can share it and publish it where tons of people can see it, whether it's on DM's Guild or putting it on a blog or whatever it is. And you can get instantaneous access to that kind of thing. But back in the day when these classes were published, that wasn't an option. We didn't have the ability to share that. So at the time, the best way to share your creation, if you were interested in creating content for the game, was to try to get it published in a fanzine or in a professional magazine. So there were a ton of these. There was Dragon, there was White Dwarf coming out of the UK, there was Imagine, there was Space Gamer and Ares. There were a lot of those. And then there were all the fanzines, Alarms and Excursions we've talked about before, Les Ans d'Anjou, by Linda Kafka, that started out as a diplomacy zine that kind of like morphed into a D&D zine over time. Those were places where you could share information. But over time, Dragon kind of became the primary place where people would look for information on new classes. And so I'm telling you, like back in the day, if you were a subscriber, or if you just went to the store every month to get your copy, and this showed up, in the mail, and you saw that there was a new class in there, you would be so excited because it was a new thing to try, and you were getting new creative ideas. And this is what really helped inspire you at the time. So I wanted to look at some of those, and I thought the best way to do this one particular one, a lot of people that ask me like, hey, I've been doing my history videos on different classes, and people said you should cover the classes from Dragon Magazine. And I am doing a whole history video series on Dragon Magazine. And so I'll get to those little by little, but I kind of thought I would do a little treat here to just talk about some classes that were featured here in the Best of Dragon Volume 2. So this is covering the first 4 years of Dragon Magazine. So this is going to go from 1976 through 1980, like I said. And there's just quite a few classes in here. And I thought it would, again, just kind of be fun to look at like why they picked the ones that are in here, and look at some of the mechanics behind them and how you can kind of still be inspired by these mechanics that were written for the original version of the game, or in some cases for first edition AD&D, and then use them in a game that you play today. So I play BX, Basic Expert Moldvay D&D from 1981. That's the system I run for my daughter, and I still use ideas from classes in here. So in the introduction here, they talk about putting together this volume and how they were trying to pick what was going to be in here. And one of the things that they did in this volume of Best of Dragon, unlike the very first volume that we talked about before, was in that volume, the first one, they kind of kept the original art and layout from the articles. And so there was no consistent look and feel to the presentation. And in this magazine, they decided what they were going to do was update the layout from those old articles and provide new art so that, again, everything kind of has a consistent feel to it. All right, so here we have new NPCs, and then it says old favorites. So that's one of the things that happened in Dragon Magazine very early on. So if you remember in Strategic Review, which was the predecessor magazine from TSR that preceded Dragon, they had new classes that debuted in there, most notably being the Ranger, the Illusionist, which was a magic user subclass, and the Bard class. And I'm going to pause again because it seems like this always happens. There is some emergency vehicles and sirens outside. Okay, I think it's wearing off now. So those classes debuted in that magazine, and they just called them character classes. Like, here's a new class that you can try, or they call them variant classes, I believe. By the time you get to Dragon and sort of later into the history, they start to kind of say that these classes are NPC or non-player character classes. And there's an interesting little section here where they talk about how it's safe to assume that the term non-player character didn't exist before the game of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that that's probably true. So it's a term that we use all the time now. I mean, it's even been like in a movie title. I think that one with, was it Ryan Reynolds was in that? And And we use it all the time, especially in like video games. We talk about NPCs, but that wasn't a thing before the game of Dungeons and Dragons, which created this idea that there are players that are not played by people. And so it talks a little bit about that. And then it essentially, what it's saying is that all these classes that are in here are for non-player characters. They're for the DM to use as adversaries or potentially allies of the player characters. The reason for that was, they don't really get into it here, but part of it was because there was this thought that these classes were created by fans and they're not maybe necessarily balanced, or they're not play tested. And the editors of the magazine weren't going to do that work for them. So they're basically accepting the manuscripts pretty much as is. I mean, they might edit them a little bit, but they're not going to substantially change the mechanics of a class. And so they would warn you, like every time they publish a class, they would tell you straight up the gate, like, we recommend that you don't use this for player characters because it hasn't been play tested to see if it's balanced. And so the only classes that were considered official were the ones that were by Gary Gygax that appeared in the magazines and in much later issues, starting with issue number 63, the Barbarian class. We've talked about that before. And then there was the Thief Acrobat in number 69. And then there was the Cavalier class in number 72. And that was the last official class that Gary published in the magazine before he ended up leaving the company, in the mid 80s. So anyway, they talk about the classes here, and so let's just jump in and start talking about what was included here. And they do mention really quickly that some of the classes that they included were the Anti-Paladin and the Ninja. And it said the Ninja was the most requested reprint in this volume. So by this point, that Ninja class probably had been out of print and very difficult to get. And so they wanted to reprint that, and people have been requesting it. And it just gives you a peek into the time period, like, that whole idea of like Japanese culture and samurai and ninjas, especially ninjas, were super popular in the early 80s. And so that's why that class was in here. And then there's the Anti-Paladin. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they mentioned that they included it, even though they intended to cut off the selections at issue number 38, but the Anti-Paladin was so popular, it was in issue 39, and so they snuck it in here. And that is, in fact, the first class that they're going to use, or are going to put in here, is the Anti-Paladin. So this is by George, I think it's Laking, and Tim Mesford. So George wrote a few articles for Dragon Magazine, some on D&D, some on other games. There was one on Guard. He did an article for the game Dungeon. And I think there was even one about the game Risk. And then he wrote like a generic article on like funerals and how to like incorporate them into a game, so system neutral article like that. And then Tim Mesford, as far as I can tell, this was the only thing that I've seen that was published. Maybe he wrote other stuff, but if so, I haven't been able to find it anywhere. But this is the Anti-Paladin. So why is it called the Anti-Paladin? Well, when this class was created, originally Paladins could only be lawful good in alignment. Well, the original Paladin was a subclass of fighter for the original D&D game. And in that version of the game, we've talked about this before, there were only 3 alignments: lawful, neutral, and chaotic. And so Paladins had to be lawful from the start of their career. And if they had been so, and if they met other qualifications, if you were what was called a fighting man, you could then become a Paladin. Once AD&D debuts in 1978, in the player's handbook, the Paladin class in there was lawful good, and it was only lawful good. And that was pretty much the case all the way up through at least 3rd edition. And I know, like in 5e now, Paladins can be of any alignment, but back in the day, they were the epitome of lawful good. And so the Anti-Paladin, this was a class, and it was specifically created to be an NPC, a foil for your characters, like, the big bad that you might put up in a campaign. And they were chaotic evil. So they're like the anti-lawful good. They are chaotic evil. And basically they go through, and the powers are kind of what you would sort of expect. There's a really interesting table here on how they generate their abilities. One of the funny ones was for charisma. It basically says that Anti-Paladins are either horrifically ugly, because they're so evil, or they're like devilishly handsome and charming. And so the way that you roll your charisma is you roll a d4. And if you get a 1, that means your charisma is 3. If you get a 2, that means your charisma is 4. If you get a 3, your charisma is 17. And if you get a 4, your charisma is 18. So you had a 50% chance to have either a really horrible or a really good charisma score. Everything else, you just took the base number and then you rolled an extra die to see what you got. So that's it. And then it's basically they get a lot of powers that are similar to paladins, but like opposite. So they lay on hands, and instead of curing wounds, they cause wounds. They are immune to disease. They get bonuses on saving throws. Instead of turning undead, they can control demons and devils and undead as like an anti-cleric, what they called the anti-clerics at the time, or evil high priest, that kind of thing. And then there's this whole section here. They get the thief backstabbing ability, and then they get a whole section here on poison and how they use poison. In fact, there's a whole table for that. So that was a big deal at the time. So kind of an interesting article here. I love the level titles. We've talked a little bit about level titles. I had a whole short about them. If you watch any of my shorts, you'll see I've talked about how you can still use level titles in games today. But I thought that was kind of fun. So looking at some of those names, the kind of retainers that they can get. And then it just kind of goes on. It talks, here's the whole section on the retainers and what they get at higher levels. So that's basically your anti-paladin. It's a pretty long article. It talks about how to play them as a DM, like, how you would role play an anti-paladin, like what their goals might be. And then they show you what the original layout was, which this is a fun touch. I thought since they've updated the layout for this magazine, they're also showing you what the original would have looked like. So you see that's the original drawing that was done for the anti-paladin. Okay, so that's that. And then there's this really fun section here. There were 4 classes that were published in issue number 3 from October of 1976. And it was a big enough deal. They actually called that out on the cover of the magazine. They had 4 new classes. So here you have the Samurai. This is from 1976 by Mike Childers. And so Samurais are interesting because very, very early on, they start to appear in fan-produced content for D&D. So there was a version that was published in the zine. We've talked about the zine before, Alarms and Excursions by Lee Gold, that was being published out here in California. And there was an early version of the Samurai that appeared in that class, in that zine. And then also there was one in the Manual of Arania, which was again, this was a publication, not a zine. It was a supplement or a book that was published by the folks out here in California from the Arrow Hobbies group that were responsible for having created the Thief class. So if you watch my video on the history of the Thief and the Rogue, you know that class was not created by Gary Gygax. It was created by some other folks in California. And some of the people that were responsible for the creation of that class were a little kind of annoyed that they felt they didn't really get the credit that they deserved for having created that class, because Gary ends up publishing it in the Greyhawk Supplement 1, and they're not really mentioned that it was based on something that someone else did. He does publish it in a newsletter before that, the Great Plains Games Players newsletter, and he does credit like a phone call that he had with one of the folks, but that had much smaller distribution, obviously. So the main publication where the Thief debuts, they didn't get credit. And so anyway, they published a whole group of classes in this very rare kind of publication called the Manual of Arania, and in it there was a Samurai class in there. Okay, but this is the first one that's being published by TSR, by Dragon Magazine, right? So again, it's not official, but it's kind of fun. It's really interesting, though, the presentation. So if you see, again, they are trying to create a consistent presentation in this magazine, but there's no experience point table for this. There's no level titles. There's none of that. So it's basically like just a fighter subclass. And so the assumption is you're just going to play a fighter, and then you get like just extra goodies from, they have critical hits and like what kind of weapons they'd use. And they have some unarmed combat rules here. It's very short and sweet. Not very detailed. This is coming out in October of 1976. So this class would have been created for the original D&D game, because at this point, there were no other versions of the game. The Holmes Basic set is going to be a year away, as well as Advanced D&D Player's Handbook is going to be published 2 years later. So this was for original D&D, as was this article here on Healers. This is by C. Hedelstad, and again, I can't find anything else that this author created. They're only listed once in the Dragon Magazine Index as an author. So it says that they're basically a mix of magic user and cleric with a dash of fighter, but basically they're exactly what you would think. They're just there for healing. The level titles here are hilarious because it's basically is saying that they're doctors. So they start out as apprentices, and then freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and then they go through interns and residents and senior residents and medics and then doctors. So that's your healer class. And then you have Berserker by John Pickens. Now, this one is probably the most famous author of all these classes in here. So John Pickens ends up working at TSR for years. He meets Gary Gygax early on because he is interested in war games, and in particular in a magazine called Strategy and Tactics. We've talked about this before. And he wants to acquire some back issues, and the publisher of that magazine didn't have any. And so he ended up writing a letter to a collector, which was Gary Gygax, asking if he could buy some of his back issues. So he meets Gary at a convention, gets introduced to chainmail and later on to D&D. And he's one of the very earlier creators of content for Dungeons and Dragons, including this Berserker class. So this is predating, any kind of like official barbarian class from D&D. And it's really based on this idea of being associated with a clan of like lycanthropes, right? Were-rats, werewolves, wereboars, etc. And that was kind of like their Berserker connection. And so it's a really fun kind of idea of a way to play that. But again, there's really no standard experience points table or anything like that. It says that, they're only human. It's a fighter subclass. So, the idea is that you would just use all the fighter tables as normal and then just add all this extra stuff on here. Then you've got your scribes. Again, I can't find anything else written by this author in Dragon Magazine. But this is the last one from that article on the 4 new subclasses that you see here. So these are scribes, and these are basically exactly what you would think they are. They're just people that can copy magical scrolls and things like that, it's the shortest of the articles. All right, now we've got your ninja here. July 1978. And it was originally published in issue number 16. So this is by Sheldon Price. Interestingly enough, this is a very detailed article. I can't find a lot of other RPG content that was created by Sheldon. But you get into all the abilities here. Now, what's interesting is it's referencing a lot of other classes that had appeared in Dragon Magazine. We're going to get to that in a second. But you just see here the language of the time. Non-human and female ninja exist, though they are rare. And then it says elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans can become ninja. Okay, so it talks a little bit about that. It gets into their abilities. Tracking like a ranger. They can simulate death. There's this whole huge section on poison. So that, really big into poison back then, because you saw that with the Anti-Paladin. And I think it's interesting because I think it's something that we don't really take advantage of today. And I'm trying to use it more in my games now because I think it's a fun thing that kind of gets overlooked as someone who's an expert at using poisons and how that can affect you, and how that can affect player characters in a game. All right. So then it talks about fighting. And so this is the part I was going to say. So it says they use combat steps as a fighter, the combat table, and then they have the combat adds, like they get better as a fighter, and then they attack open-handed as a monk. So that's referring to the monk from the Player's Handbook. You see this coming out in July 1978. So it's already referring to the Player's Handbook. And then it says they may use judo as a samurai. So the implication is you would have access to this article here. Now, that might have been put in because it does say in the early part here that the editor of this magazine, I should point out, is Kim Mohan, famous person in TSR history. So Kim talks about how they updated some of the articles in here to kind of like make, like he says, they were revised because, an editor has to resist the temptation to tinker with an article. So it's possible that part in there was put in there because they knew that you were reading this article on the ninja in this magazine that has the samurai in it. So anyway, this is your ninja. You've got your level titles here. And the author talks about how it's based on this book, The Art of Invisibility, which I believe is the same book that Lee Gold based her version of the ninja on. There is a ninja published in Alarms and Excursions, the fanzine, before this comes out, like years before, like 2 or 3 years before. And if I remember correctly, I think Lee Gold also references this same book as far as creating the ninja class. So it talks about disguise, which is a huge part of the ninja. And this is like how they can disguise themselves and what kind of weapons that they would carry. Later on, the ninja class is going to appear in Oriental Adventures, 1985 hardback book. Published for Advanced D&D, and in it, the class is always disguising themselves as another class. They don't operate in the open. So that's kind of something that was taken, or at least in connection with this article. So again, very typical of the time. You have adjustments for females and for non-humans. This is as far as the thief skills. So basically saying that women are better at picking locks and finding traps and picking pockets and everything, moving silently, everything else. So, and then they're cumulative if you have a bonus for elf, dwarf, or halfling and women. Very typical of the time to include tables like this of differences between men and women of approaching skills. So that's something that's just fallen out of favor over time with the game, and for the better, I think. So there's this whole section on equipment here and tools. I don't know why tools and equipment are separate, but they are. You've got ninja weapons, which is kind of fun. And you can see it's a pretty long article here. So it goes into the effects of the different weapons. And then there's the new improved ninja. So this is from about a year later, issue number 30, and same author, and basically says he's updating it based on Ninja, the Invisible Assassins. This is a different book, and so he's read that, and then he's updating basically the weapons. So all the different weapons that they can use and tools. So it's not really an update to the class as much as to like the equipment that they would use. And so then you have here just the end of this article, the armor class adjustment for all these different weapons and things like that, damage for different sizes of opponents. And then the original layout of that particular article from Dragon Magazine number 30. So again, you're going to see some of these classes eventually make their way into the canon of D&D. So of course, we talked about how in 5th edition D&D, there are paladins of every single alignment. There was a very famous article that was published later in edition of Dragon. I don't remember which issue off the top of my head. I think it might have been a 106. I'll put it in the screen cap here. But there was an article where somebody created a whole bunch of different alignment paladins, like the 7 other alignments other than lawful good and chaotic evil. But at the time, that was a huge deal because paladins were only lawful good. You do see other classes that like the samurai shows up again in Oriental Adventures, and in 1985, healers are part of the game, kind of never as a main class, but they show up from time to time. I believe there was one in the complete miniatures handbook for 3E. Berserkers are kind of more just as that barbarian type. Scribes show up here and there. I know there was one in a second, or in a basic, like the Hollow World product for again, like basic D&D. Ninjas, there was a complete ninja handbook for 2nd edition, so that was a thing, and that's about it. And so that's our look at the different some of the different classes in early issues of Dragon Magazine. So definitely let me know what you think about this, if you like this kind of presentation, if you'd like to see me do more of these types of dives into the classes of Dragon. Again, I am going to be covering Dragon sort of in 1 year periods of time. So I will be doing issues 1 through 12 of Dragon. I'm coming up in a future video, but because I'm going to be covering so many issues at once, I wouldn't be able to go into as much detail on specifically the classes. So if that's something that interests you, definitely let me know if that's something you'd like to see me do, kind of like as an addition to those deep dives into Dragon Magazine, if you'd like to see me also do deep dives into some of the classes. So again, just drop that into the comments below, and also if you could please make sure to like the video and to subscribe to my channel if you have not already done so. I would really appreciate it. And if you're a new subscriber, I would love for you to drop a comment and let me know how you found out about the channel, and a little bit about what you'd like to see on the channel, and maybe why what it was that got you to subscribe. I'd appreciate hearing about that. So I would really appreciate it. Also below, while you're in the comments, you'll find places where you can join me online on social media, on Facebook and on the site formerly known as Twitter, on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. And, I would say I'm probably most active of all those actually on Twitter or X, but, I am trying to branch out into some other channels as well. And you'll also find places where you can support my channel by buying something from my shop. So I commissioned years ago, some custom designs that are specific only to my shop. One of the things I did was find all the patent designs for different types of dice. So the D20 patent or the D8, the D4, the three that I have right now. And I work with an artist to clean those up because they were not high res and to make them into, a design that's going to print really well. And you can get that on things like, imagine getting that on a poster to put in your game room or given to a friend for the holidays, or getting on a t-shirt or a hoodie or a mug or a notebook. Maybe you want to have a notebook to use for your gaming sessions. So that's a great place where you can buy something like that. And it's the perfect way to help support my shop and my channel and let me know that you are supporting me by doing that, since I don't really have other forms of generating income from doing this right now. So I would really, really appreciate it. And that's basically going to be it for this particular video. So I would like to say thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now it's time for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to while I was making the notes for this video. And what I was drinking was this. So this is the last of it. You'll notice lately I've been kind of emptying some of my bottles. Partly it's because I hold on to these when I just have a little bit left, and I kind of felt like, what's the point of doing that? I might as well, share it. And my wife is not a big Scotch drinker, so I thought I would share this with you all today. So today is St. Andrew's Day. It's November 30th, and St. Andrews is the patron saint of Scotland. So I thought it was the perfect time to pour myself a wee dram of Uisce Beatha. Beha, I believe it's pronounced Uisce Beatha, which translates as water of life, which is what whiskey means in Scottish Gaelic. And so this is Highland Park. They're HARALD. It's part of a series of different types of whiskeys, but this is HARALD, which is a single malt Scotch. And it's very pale in color. Again, I just have a little bit left, and I thought I would just, again, go ahead and finish it off. So I saved a little bit after I made my notes for the video so that I could toast you all and say cheers, or sláinte in Scottish. All right, so there's that. And then the album I was listening to is the Pogues. So I just heard the news this morning that Shane MacGowan passed away just today on November 30th. He was the lead singer of the Pogues. And so I pulled this record out of my collection to give it a spin. This is probably their best known album, If I Should Fall from Grace with God. And this is kind of when they started to get, it's still rooted in Irish folk or Celtic folk, whatever you want to call that. But there's a little bit of punk sensibilities to the band, but this is kind of where they started to branch out a little bit and explore some different types of genres besides just that. Their most famous song of all pretty much of the band's history really is going to be this one, Fairy Tale of New York, which is actually a Christmas song. Or at least I think of it as being a Christmas song. It's been rated in the UK as being the top Christmas song of all time. I love it. It is one of my favorite Christmas songs that I make sure to listen to every year. It's just a very melancholy and sad state of affairs during the holiday season between two people that are very kind of damaged, and they find each other. Now, I will warn you, if you've not heard this song before, there is a word in here that people just don't use anymore. It's a slur, and it's not a nice word at all. So I just want to point that out to you that, I don't agree with the use of that word, but I agree with it in this context of the song. The singer, Kirsty MacColl, it's her character, uses this word, and she describes it as like, that's how this character would talk because she's not a nice person. So I get that. She's not saying it's okay to call people this word, but anyway, I don't want to belabor that too much because the song really is beautiful, and I highly recommend you give it a listen. Or just any Pogues album today, like, pour yourself some Irish whiskey if you have some. I did not have Irish today, and I had Scotch again, as I pointed out for for St. Andrew's Day. But I just kind of wanted to recognize the genius of Shane McGowan and his band, the Pogues. So that is all again for today. And cheers and happy holidays. And again, thanks for watching.